reading The Unknown Reality by Jane Roberts, a Seth book, Volume 2. Alright, so it says session 718, and Rob explains that session 717 was deleted or became personal material here, and it's going to explain it. So I'm just going to read. So Rob is writing that before what they had expected for their regular session for Monday evening, Jane had told him that she had awakened in the middle of the previous night with insights about two practice elements Seth would discuss. But we didn't hear from Seth, even though she felt him quote-unquote around as they had prepared for the session. So instead, a development took place that left them puzzled, intrigued, and more than a little upset. Yet at this writing, immediately following the 718th session, he notes that they'd been somewhat relieved by subsequent events. So Rob states that now, in fact, I'm veering toward the idea that Monday night's session marked a distinct step in the further development of Jane's abilities. She may also use some of that new material in her book, Psychic Politics, and she actually does. He adds, it seems that a combination of factors led to those oddly disturbing yet challenging events in the 717th session, the deleted one. One is probably just the state of Jane's recent exceptional psychic receptivity. Another is my own longtime interest in the American psychologist and philosopher William James, 1842 to 1910. He wrote the classic book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. A third is a letter received last week from a Jungian psychologist who had been inspired by Seth's material on the Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist Carl Jung, 1875 to 1961. In chapter 13 of Seth Speaks. So he had read that and became intrigued, and so he wrote them. And a fourth factor would be a most evocative experience Jane had Monday afternoon, in which she found herself experiencing consciousness as an ordinary housefly. From that minute but enthralling viewpoint, she knew, quote-unquote, herself crawling up a giant-sized blade of grass. She was exploring the, quote, worldview, end quote, the worldview of a fly. This adventure was certainly a preparation for the developments in the 717th private session. Rob continues, he says, other reasons must enter in, of course, but for now, let's say that Jane knows of James and his work. She's read part of his Varieties, for instance, but seemed rather put off by it, where I reread passages from it frequently. The letter from the Jungian psychologist evidently provided the immediate impetus for the fly episode, and for Monday evening's events, though. The author requested additional material from Seth on Jung, or his works. I hardly think it accidental now that such an inquiry came just when Jane's abilities seemed about to ripen, in the particular way that they did that night. We were discussing the letter and half facetiously wondering whether Seth might respond in any way, when Jane suddenly told me that she was picking up material on the quote-unquote essence of William James. Because of his own persistent melancholy, she said James had been able to understand others with the same kind of disposition. As she continued to give her impressions, though, I wondered, why James? He wasn't mentioned in the psychologist's letter, for instance. Why this picking up on and identifying with a famous dead personality? Most likely, Rob's own interest in James's work exerted some kind of influence upon Jane's newly developing abilities, he thought. But still, that didn't answer his question. And he adds, what had happened to Seth? That individual would have to wait. And then, quoting Jane, she says, I was getting just now that James called his melancholy a cast of soul. Her eyes were closed. And she adds, now I'm getting a book. Why, it's a paperback. I see this printed material, only it's very small, almost microscopic, and oddly enough, the whole thing is printed on a grayish type paper. I see it really small in my mind. End quote by Jane. And then Rob adds, and with that, in an altered state of consciousness, Jane began delivering last Monday evening the material from the book she mentally saw. Before I fully realized what was happening, I was taking her words down verbatim. And Rob adds, the material itself was beautifully done, rather quaint in expression, but of excellent quality. Here's a small quotation from it, dealing with part of a vision, quote-unquote, James had following his physical death. So here's part of what Jane picked up from William James. It says, quote, there was a procession of the gods that went before my very eyes. I wondered and watched silently. Each god or goddess had a poet who went in company, and the poets sang that they gave reason voice. They sang gibberish, yet as I listened, the gibberish turned into a philosophical dialogue. The words struck at my soul. A strange mirror image type of action followed, for when I spoke the poet's words backwards, to my intellect, they made perfect sense. End quote by William James. William James's Essence. And Seth is going to explain all of this shortly, so keep that in mind. All right, Rob adds, at one of our breaks, Jane said that she had picked up the title of the James book from which she'd been, quote-unquote, reading. It was called The Varieties of Religious States, with only states differing from his book Experience, The Varieties of Religious Experience, in the name of James's book In Our Physical Reality. She'd also felt Seth around, like a supervisor perhaps. She added, quote, I felt as if the James stuff was coming from a person who was very intent about trying to say something. End quote by Jane. Rob states then, which pointed up our dilemma, I thought at the time. I said little to Jane, but I was most uneasy that she was delivering material supposedly from a member of the famous dead. Actually, we'd always thought that such performances were somehow suspect. Not that mediums or others couldn't communicate with the quote-unquote dead. But to us, anyhow, exhibitions involving well-known personages usually seem psychologically tainted. So our feelings about the night's affair weren't of the best at that point. And Rob states the events to come didn't help matters any either. No sooner had Jane finished with the lengthy James material than she promptly began to get impressions from, quote, Carl Jung, end quote. This time she was almost apologetic. We decided to go ahead, though Jane didn't see a book or have any visual data. The words just came to her along with strong emotional feelings that she connected with Jung. Okay, and Rob adds, the material seemed endless. It was a few minutes before midnight when Jane just stopped, saying that she'd more or less had it, in quotes, for the evening. The Jung material felt much more animated, she added, with a lot of vitality and energy to it. Quote, she says, he really seemed excitable, end quote. Neither of us found the Jung passages as evocative as the James material, however. This is a brief Jungian excerpt. So, this is like the essence of Carl Jung. Quote, numbers have an emotional equivalent in that their symbols originally arouse from the libido that always identifies itself with the number 1 and feels all other numbers originating out of itself. The libido knows itself as God, and therefore all fractions fly out of the self-structure of its own reality. End quote by A Essence of Carl Jung. And Rob adds that Jane said she had the impression of someone very compact, loaded with energy, almost wildly adolescent in a way, going off in too many directions at once. And Rob adds, we both wondered right then if Jane was going off in too many directions at once. She'd always refused to try to, quote, reach the dead, end quote, in this way before. Both of us were more than a little troubled, but as usual, we were intrigued, even as we questioned our own reactions. We were also quite aware of the humorous aspects of the situation, since Jane does speak for at least one of the quote-unquote dead, Seth. And, of course, as we sat for tonight's session, we wondered if Seth would discuss what had happened Monday night. And also, he states, I'd just begun typing the, quote, James and Jung, quote, end quote, material. So from my original notes, I read the rest of it to Jane as we waited for Seth to come through. So Seth to come through for the actual 718th session. And he says, I also thought she discussed an excellent idea of her own, saying that she believed that the James Jung episode itself was an exercise in making the unknown reality known. She'd already done some writing yesterday for her psychic politics book, leading toward this view. So whatever we learned through Seth this evening, we already felt reasonably sure that in usual trite terms, Jane hadn't been communicating directly with two such famous personalities. Instead, she was involved in something quite a bit different and much more believable. So, Seth states in the official 718th session, he says, now, this section of Unknown Reality deals with the various exercises that will, I hope, provide you with your own intimate glimpses into previously unknown realities. I said in the 711th and 716th session, for instance, that your normal focus of consciousness can be compared to your home station. So far, exercises have been described that will gently lead you away from concentration upon this home base, even while its structure is strengthened at the same time. You can also call this home station or local program your world view, since from it you perceive your reality. To some extent, it represents your personal focus, through which you interpret most of your experience. As I mentioned in the 715th session, when you begin to move away from that particular organization, strange things may start to happen. You may be filled with wonder, excitement, or perplexity. You may be delighted or appalled, according to whether or not your new perceptions agree or disagree with your established worldview. Instead of a regular session last Monday night, the framework of the session was used in a new kind of exercise. It was meant as an example of what can happen under the best of circumstances when someone leaves a native worldview and tunes into another quite different from the original. You always form your own experience. Rupert picked up on the worldview of a man known dead. He was not directly in communication with William James. He was aware, however, of the universe through William James's worldview. As you might dial a program on a television set, Rupert tuned in to the view of reality now held in the mind of William James. Because that view necessarily involved emotions, Rupert felt some sense of emotional contact, but only with the validity of the emotions. Each person has such a worldview, whether living or dead in your terms, and that, quote, living picture, end quote, that living picture exists despite time or space. It can be perceived by others. Each worldview exists at its own particular quote-unquote frequency and can only be tuned in by those who are more or less within the same range. However, the frequencies themselves have to be adjusted properly to be brought into focus, and those adjustments necessitate certain intents and sympathies. It is not possible to move into such a worldview if you are basically at odds with it, for example. You simply will not be able to make the proper adjustments. Rupert has been working with alterations of consciousness for her psychic politics and wondering about the basic validity of religion. He has been trying to reconcile intellectual and emotional knowledge. James is far from one of his favorite writers, yet Rupert's interests, intent, and desire were close enough so that under certain conditions he could experience the worldview held by James. The unknown reality is unknown only because you believe it must be hidden. Once that belief is annihilated, the other, quite as legitimate views of reality can appear to your consciousness, and worlds just as valid as your own swim into view. To do this, you must have faith in yourself and in the framework of your known reality. Otherwise, you will be too afraid to abandon even briefly the habitual, organized view of the world that is your own. Even in your life as you understand it, if you are insecure or frightened, you cannot properly see your family or your neighbors. If you are afraid, then your own fears stand between yourself and others. You do not dare take your eyes off yourself for 1 second. You cannot afford to be friendly, for instance, because you are terrified of being rebuffed. In the same way, if you are overly concerned about the nature of your own reality, and if you are looking to others to justify your existence, you will not be able to abandon your own worldview successfully, for you will feel too threatened. Or traveling in psychic exercises even slightly away from your own home station, you will still try to take your familiar paraphernalia with you and interpret even entirely new situations of consciousness in the light of your own worldview. You will transpose your own set of assumptions then into conditions in which they may not really fit at all. Rupert picked up on William James's worldview because their interests coincided. A letter from a Jungian psychologist helped serve as a stimulus. The psychologist asked me, or Seth, to comment about Jung. Rupert felt little correspondence with Jung. In the back of his mind, he wondered about James, mainly because he knew that Joseph or Rob enjoyed one of James's books. Now, it is quite possible to tune in to the worldview of any person, living or dead in your terms. The worldview of any individual, even not yet born from your standpoint, exists nevertheless. Rupert's experience simply serves as an example of what is possible. Quite rightly, he did not interpret the event in conventional terms, and Joseph did not suppose that James himself was communicating in the way usually imagined. Joseph did recognize the excellence of the material. James was not aware of the situation. For that matter, James himself is embarked upon other adventures. Rupert picked up on James's worldview, however, as in your terms at least, it quote-unquote existed perhaps 10 years ago. Then, in his mind, James playfully thought of a book that he would write were he quote-unquote living, called The Varieties of Religious States, an altered version of a book he wrote in life. He felt that the soul chooses states of emotion as you would choose, say, a state to live in. He felt that the chosen emotional state was then used as a framework through which to view experience. He began to see a conglomeration of what he loosely called religious states, each different and yet each serving to unify experience in the light of its particular quote, natural features, end quote. These natural features would appear as the ordinary temperaments and inclinations of the soul. Rupert tuned into that unwritten book. It carried the stamp of James's own emotional state at the quote-unquote time, when he was viewing his earthly experience in your terms, from the standpoint of one who had died, could look back and see where he thought his ideas were valid and where they were not. At that point in his existence, there were changes. The plan for the book existed and still does. In Rupert's quote-unquote present, he was able to see this worldview as expressed within James's immortal mind. To do this, Rupert had to be free enough to accept the view of reality as perceived by someone else. To accomplish this, Rupert allowed one portion of his consciousness to remain securely anchored in its own reality, while letting another portion soak up, so to speak, a reality not its own. The unknown reality. Again, because of your precise orientation, you are often theoretically intrigued by the contemplation of worlds not your own. And while you may often yearn for some evidence of those other realities, you are just as apt to become scandalized by the very evidence that you have so earnestly requested. Rupert has embarked upon his own journeys into the unknown reality. I cannot do that for him. I can only point out the way, as I do for each reader. In his own new book, Psychic Politics, Rupert has his personal way of explaining what he is experiencing, and since he shares the same reality with you, then you will be able to relate, perhaps better even, to his explanations than to mine. However, it is quite possible for him to tune into James's complete book if he desires to, for that work is indeed a psychic reality, a plan or a model existing in the inward order of activity. Such creative, quote, architect's plans, end quote, such creative architect's plans are often unknowingly picked up by others, altered or changed, ending up as entirely new productions. Most writers do not examine their sources that closely. The same applies, of course, to any field of endeavor. Many quite modern and sophisticated developments have existed in what you think of now as past civilizations. The plans as models were picked up by inventors, scientists, and the like, and altered to their own specific directions, so that they emerged in the world not as copies, but as something new. Many so-called archaeological discoveries were made when individuals suddenly tuned into a worldview of another person, not of your space or time. Before you have the confidence to leave your own particular home station, however, you must be secure within it. You must know it will, quote, be there, end quote. You must know it will be there when you get back. Alright, they're taking their break, and I'm just going to read this part right here. You guys can read the other parts if you'd like. But it says, quote, Jane says, quote, I felt out of the James thing until you read it to me before the session. Then a lot of aspects about it came back. We won't bother doing that book of his, I know, but I could get it, the whole thing. It's right there in the library. End quote by Jane, which she actually did do, as I'm sure most of you know. It says that they talked about what an interesting product the varieties of religious states would be, and the many implications involved, without intending to do anything more about such a work. Alright, right up here is the rest of those notes that I'm not going to read. And I'm going to split this video up into two, and so just go to the next video when that one's ready, and you'll be able to hear the rest of session 718, which, by the way, gets a lot more interesting. So definitely look for the next video. And for those who want a sneak peek, go ahead and pause and read.